how to write and pitch editorials. Please welcome the voice of reason and senior editor TK Arun.
Yeah, let's first be clear on what we mean by an editorial. See, the newspaper has its own views, which is presented in that column on the edit page, unsigned pieces of opinion. This is strictly speaking, the editorial. Most people understand by the term editorial an opinion piece which is signed by a writer.
So, how do you approach writing an editorial?
An advice I got from Swaminathan Iyer when I joined the Economic Times. Don't worry if you don't really know much about a topic you plan to write on. Your job is to learn as much as you can about the subject in the time you have, digest it, form an opinion, and present it as if it were your lifelong conviction.
What's the best practice in structuring an opinion article piece?
So this is something very important. In a regular article, people tend to put their conclusion, the main point of what they have to say, right at the end of the article, right? But in an article for a newspaper, you say upfront in the first paragraph your main thesis. What do you want to say?
Writers tend to highlight their own company's contribution to the matter as well.
Yeah. So if that is indispensable, that you cannot make that argument without drawing from the company's own experience, we allow that. But if it can be made without referring to the company's own experience, then you ask them to rephrase that part.
What kind of editorials performing the best?
Long ago in the 90s, the Times Group commissioned a survey to find out what proportion of readers actually read the editorial page. Editorial page is like the Gita or the Bible or the Quran. You keep it in the house. It's a very respected, valuable resource that you have. You don't read it on a daily basis. You might not. But when you are in doubt and when you need to form an opinion, you consult. So the editorial page is there every day.
Hello and welcome to the show Indian Media with Dhiren and Experts. Here we discuss trends and opportunities in the media and entertainment sector that impact careers and businesses. I am your host Dhiren. Joining us today on the show is a polyglot. For over 2 decades, his editorials in the Economic Times have provided insightful analysis. Please welcome the voice of reason and senior editor TK Arun. Sir, thank you for accepting my invite. Today I want to discuss with the audience and basically to learn how to write and pitch editorials. But before we begin discussing the topic, I'd request you to please take us through your career journey and tell us how you came about writing editorials, which in my opinion is quite a lonely pursuit.
So actually, I started journalism, strangely enough, writing editorials. This normally doesn't happen. Most people start journalism either at the desk or in reporting. And then after having spent many years doing that and having acquired an understanding of different sectors, then they graduate to writing editorials. So I joined the Observer of Business and Politics. Basically, I was hired to write editorial. Now, I had done my master's in economics from JNU. I'd done some work on my doctoral thesis, which I not complete. I had worked for some time with the Kerala State Planning Board. So probably the editors at the Observer thought that I could perhaps write editorials. Although I must admit that initially my familiarity with the economy as it works wasn't all that great. I learned fast. Now I can tell you an advice I got from Swaminathan Iyer, who became my edit page editor when I joined the Economic Times. He told me, don't worry if you don't really know much about a topic you plan to write on. Your job is to learn as much as you can about the subject in the time you have, digest it, form an opinion, and present it as if it were your lifelong conviction. So, and this is the thing that I've been trying to do. You try to understand stuff. You can even, if you have time, you have the luxury of even talking to people, perhaps a beat reporter or somebody else more experienced in the sector, get a perspective, and then form an opinion. The opinion is your own. It will not help you to reproduce somebody else's opinion. And then you write it as well as you can.
Sir, is there any
topic is how it came to writing editorial.
Sir, is there any topic on which you haven't written yet?
Economic Times is a very unusual newspaper. It is a newspaper for businessmen. So it doesn't just cover business, because businessmen need to know about politics. They understand that geopolitics affects them. They need to know what's happening in the stock market, the financial markets, global politics, changes in technology. So that's a very broad range of subjects that a newspaper for businessmen needs to cover. So ET does cover quite a bit. And since the edit page is required to formulate opinion and present an opinion on all these range of subjects, over time, you try to learn something about all these things. And it's not all that difficult as one might think. I mean, my job has been to ingest information day in, day out, year after year. And then some of it stays. And then you observe patterns that, ordinary people who do one particular thing and a little more may not see. So that is the luxury that an editor of an edit page has.
So how do you approach writing an editorial? Because I think you have written editorial continuously for over 20 years, and having an opinion on different variety of subjects every day is a humongous task. Do you follow a pattern, or does it evolve? Of course it evolves, but how have you managed, how do you approach it now?
Let's first be clear on what we mean by an editorial. See, the newspaper has its own views, which is presented in that column on the edit page, unsigned pieces of opinion. This is strictly speaking, the editorial. But most people understand by the term editorial an opinion piece which is signed by a writer, might be a journalist, might be a guest writer from outside. So, I mean, both are important pieces of opinion. So, my job as the edit page editor for a long time has been to decide what should be written as a newspaper's opinion, the unsigned editorial which represents the view of the newspaper. Now, that depends on what is the most important happening developments, whether in the markets, in finance, or the economy, in politics, or telecom, or wherever. And so we write about that. We decide what to write on. And there is a team. It's not just me. We have a team of editorial writers. So we discuss. Sometimes there can be heated arguments when people disagree on a particular opinion. Then we finally reach a consensus. Then we decide who should write that. And that person writes it. And finally, it is sent to the edit page editor, which when I was the edit page editor, it was me. Is sent to that person for him to finally clear. He might rewrite some things, sharpen praise, or give a nuance to an opinion, and then finally it's sent. And as far as writing the opinion pieces, signed pieces, columns are concerned, so sometimes you write yourself, but mostly your job is to select articles from either commissioned sources or people who voluntarily come forward to say, I want to say this thing to be given some space. Then you have to choose an article and decide whether this should be carried or not. So that is another part of the edit page.
Sorry to interrupt you on this part. So whenever we see a main article in the edit page by a guest writer, usually they are all big shots. So is it a requirement that it has to be a big shot, or does the merit of the idea can also break through the break?
Yeah. So actually, it is one of the few places where you might get an article published even if you're not a big shot. If the edit page editor finds the time to go through a submission and finds that what is presented as persuasive and not forthcoming from a regular, well-known writer, then he might decide to carry it. So it's not always necessary that you need to be some well-known big shot. In fact, people become well-known by being, presented in the newspaper day in, day out.
True. There's also an issue of how a fact check is done for an edit page article. So a few years ago, I had come across one criticism in the media that sometimes factually incorrect or misleading claims were also made in edit page articles, and then it gets quoted by other reports also. So how do you ensure all these things are taken care of? Because sometimes it might come across as an opinion, but sometimes the incorrect or misleading facts are also embedded within the opinion piece.
Yeah. So when you get an edit page article from somebody who's generally trustworthy, you don't just mechanically reproduce whatever that person says. That must be plausible. It must be backed up with some data. In fact, there have been occasions when we have turned down an article because it didn't seem right, and we had to send it back. So there's no paucity of articles. There are people who keep sending you articles to publish. So even if you reject one, there is something else to replace it without much of a problem. So, and why we ourselves, journalists themselves write, they are expected to do the fact checking. And the edit page editor who vets these articles both from internal submissions and for externally commissioned pieces or voluntarily contributed pieces. We try to see if these articles are right or not. The
Right. And
data
sir,
to the best of our
sometimes,
ability.
hmm.
But we
And sir,
don't have, like in the New York Times or Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, a separate fact-checking entity who will do this. We assume that this is part of the editor's job, the page sub-editor's job, and if there is any doubt, we will cross-check with other people in the editorial team or in the reporting team or the desk in general.
And so, how do you go about the timeliness versus the importance of a topic? How do you balance the two?
So this is always a tough issue. The more topical an article, a subject is, the higher the likelihood of people reading. So you want your edit page to be relevant and of interest to people. So you generally try to get topical articles. At the same time, sometimes there are things which might not be very topical, but still substantive points are being made, which are bearing on how business is done, how the economy is prospering or not prospering, how jobs are getting created or not getting created, how policy in particular sectors, say of technology, is going astray. So you carry that.
What's the best practice in structuring an opinion article piece?
So this is something very important. In a regular article, people tend to put their conclusion, the main point of what they have to say, right at the end of the article. Right. The term conclusion still suggests that it should be what you conclude with. But in an article for a newspaper, you say upfront in the first para your main thesis, what you want to say. Because your reader doesn't have the time to wade through 800 words to figure out whether the subject is of interest to him or whether it has some novelty value or there is some reason why he should read this article. So in the first para, you write your main insight that you want to communicate to a reader. And no article should be submitted or published unless it has at least one insight, which is not all that, which has not been well circulating in the public domain or already established. So you tend to look for some insight, and that insight must be placed right up front, so it catches the attention of the reader. The second thing is then you develop the argument. Now, typically in a newspaper article, you have 800, 900 words, not more. Now, within that space, you don't have the luxury of trying to develop multiple lines of argument. You can probably develop just one line of argument. If you're very skilled, you might develop two. But most people don't have the writing skills to develop two strands of an argument within the space of 800 words. So you stick to developing one argument while asserting, saying that this is true. What are the other relevant factors? You don't try to develop them from more fundamental principles, and then you proceed to write. Right. And I think about the language and style. Many people think that it's very important to have a very attractive language. No, people are not looking for literary aesthetics in a newspaper article. They'll probably read Shakespeare when they want. They are looking for insights into current developments when they approach a newspaper article. So that should be a focus. It should be clear. It should be concise. Clarity is very, very important. And it should not be convoluted. No sacrifice of clarity for a wordplay or what you think is a literary flourish. You can cut that completely aside and focus on writing clearly and communicating.
Sir, I think these are also some of the common mistakes that most of the writers make whenever they are presenting their ideas. So, has it ever happened that you like the idea presented, but the way it was written, you had to completely change it? So, does it require for you to go back to the guest writer and ask for their approval, or how the playback works?
So mostly, if the thing is, if the person has something of interest to say and he hasn't said it well, you will send it back to him and ask him to say reformulate the article, bringing the focal point right up front and developing it. If there isn't time, you might actually make a draft and put it through for his approval or her approval. That also has happened.
So one thing that has always intrigued me is that the headlines for editorial articles are like a book title, unlike a normal news report. Why is that so?
So the headline, if you see the same article published online and in print, the headlines will be very different. In the print, there is an attempt to make it interesting. There is scope for wordplay. You could bring in a pun, or you could bring in an allusion. Whereas on the online edition, it's more straightforward because you need to be able to draw the attention of Google search or whatever the search engine is at work. The search engine doesn't have the capacity to understand irony and sarcasm and allusion. So you will completely lose your reader. Whereas in the print, your attempt is to make it more interesting. And plus, there is the illustration. Sometimes illustrations actually add value to the article. They highlight or amplify the message that is being sought to be conveyed. And so these are inputs that come from outside the writer. Very often the headline is completely changed from what the writer had submitted, because very often the writer might have a 3-word headline, or he might have a 10-word headline, but you require a particular length for the newspaper article slot to go from left to right. You need a particular space, and so you will change the headline, and within that you try to bring in the interesting twist or turn of phrase that you think will draw the reader's attention.
So while pitching an article to you or the opinion editor, can the author afford to have that short headline which sounds like a book title in the pitch mail itself?
So they can suggest a headline, but if the headline doesn't fit the slot, it'll be chopped. Very often you'll find that when you want a specialized kind of comment on a particular topic, it will have to come from a company executive. You want something from the oil industry, something about hydrocarbon in general. So you have to source it from somebody in the industry. The general observer, consultant, etc., might not have the same insight that a practicing professional would have. But when you get an article from a practicing professional, then it's a struggle to keep that person from publicizing his own company's achievements or things like that. So the article's purpose is not to give publicity to the writer's company or what achievements. For that, there should be news columns and other kind of space or interview or whatever. Here, your purpose is to highlight the particular topic on which you have been asked to write. Now, and you have the responsibility of the editor to disclose at the bottom the writer's credentials, that he comes from a particular background. And so the reader is also forewarned that he is an industry practitioner and professional. He might have a particular bias or a skew in the opinion that he presents and that he argues for. So that's only fair to the reader. Now, of course, you will let this through only if you are convinced that it doesn't have any particular corporate specific, company specific skew, and is speaking in general for the industry.
I think that is one of the major pitfalls which I have seen whenever an article is submitted. Writers tend to highlight their own company's contribution to the matter as well. So how do you balance it then? Because then the argument is supported by the work done by the author or their company.
Yeah. So if that is indispensable, that you cannot make that argument without drawing from the company's own experience, we allow that. But if it can be made without referring to the company's own experience, then you ask them to rephrase that part.
Now, the other question is from the people who want to pitch an article to you. What's the best structure to mail that article across to an opinion editor? Right,
So
starting from the subject line and then the intro, the summary, the bullet points, whatever it is.
So the first thing is to present the insight that the article wants to offer. If that is persuasive, if it is novel, if it's not something that hasn't been obvious for a long time, then it might appeal to the editor. So that is the main focus. What is that insight you want to present? Sometimes just the name of the author will also be enough. If Amartya Sen wants to write an article, or if the Prime Minister wants to write an article, just the name will suffice to for it to be carried, even if you think the article doesn't actually say anything much. So sometimes the newspapers balance very many different considerations, and of course, all these things matter.
Can you share an anecdote where a worthwhile article was accepted or rejected because the way it was pitched? And I'm not talking about some big shots writing these articles. These are articles by, say, subject matter specialists who may not have a very fancy designation.
Yeah. So I have accepted such articles. I don't want to give any specific names, but even today, you will find editors carrying articles by people who are not particularly well known, but purely on the strength of the arguments they present. They are carried. And once they are carried a couple of times, then that itself becomes name recognition, which the writer as well as the editor can rely on to legitimize carrying that person.
Right.
Young lawyers
True.
tend to get published,
Hmm.
although they don't have any name recognition. I'm sure their seniors in their own office would
Yeah.
like to have written that article, and not the young lawyer. But if the young lawyer thought of writing it and he did a good job, and so he gets a chance.
How difficult is it for an opinion editor to avoid the temptation of writing a full-fledged book?
Oh, it's very easy. You
Why
just
do you
need
say
to.
so? You can simply, so many writers have compiled their essays or edit pieces and published that as a book. So
No,
can
I
you
have not done
do
that.
the same?
So I have not done
No, I'm
that.
saying you can do that.
I can do that, but these articles are written on different occasions. Very often they come with a context. So unless you make clear that context, that article will not actually carry the full impact. And then if you want to have a detailed, annotated edition of these articles, that's a lot of effort, for which you don't really have the time.
Right.
And writing a book is actually a matter of a lot of discipline. And if you're used to writing a lot, as an edit page editor, I engage with at least 2 topics every day. Now, whether I myself write the editorials or not, these are topics we discuss in the editorial meeting. We analyze them threadbare. We decide what opinion should be formed. Then we decide who will write. And finally, that after having written that draft comes to me, and then I finalize it. So I have fully engaged with that article. It's as good as if I have written it, although I haven't actually written it. So these topics come to you, the habit of finding 2 topics on which you can form an opinion. It comes to you after this experience of doing this for years on end. So it's not all that difficult.
And sir, in
K.
terms of
Subramaniam, this current external affairs minister's father, K. Subramaniam, he used to write something called Global Scan. It's a column on world affairs, and he used to write it daily. So we asked him, "How do you write every day?" So he said, "Oh, that's very easy. I listen to the BBC early in the morning, and I am sufficiently provoked every day by what they're saying to write an article." So
yeah,
it's
yeah.
like that.
Sometimes that trigger is also required.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sir, in terms of performance of purely content in editorial versus a news report, how do you see what kind of editorials performing the best?
So editorials have no chance of competing with news articles. Long ago in the 90s, the Times Group commissioned a survey to find out what proportion of readers actually read the editorial page. So they found that in the case of Times of India, less than 3% of readers read the editorial page. In the case of the Economic Times, around 9% read the editorial. Others, people look at corporate news, they look at the political pages, they might look at the stock pages when the newspapers used to carry stock pages. They didn't read the editorial page. So the view taken by the paper on the editorial page is like this, that, the editorial page is like the Gita or the Bible or the Quran. You keep it in the house. It's a very respected, valuable resource that you have. You don't read it on a daily basis. You might not. But when you are in doubt and when you need to form an opinion, you consult it. So the editorial page is there every day. Somebody might need to consult it on a daily basis. Somebody might come to it only when they don't know what to think of a particular development. And they might think that the newspaper editorial might help them form a coherent opinion. And they come to it. And they think, oh, yeah, this is exactly what I thought. Although he might not have had that clarity, but the editorial helps him realize what should be the right opinion on a particular subject. So they come to it. Now, see, you take the Times of India. Times of India has a main section, and there is the Delhi Times, Mumbai Times, Bangalore Times, that supplement, which is entertainment and so on and so forth. Now, very often you will find that that section is the most popular segment of the newspaper in a household. Many people want to read that. Whereas for the main paper, it is. So why doesn't the publisher produce just that, and why come out with a newspaper? Thing is that works only as a supplement. If you had only Delhi Times or Bombay Times, it wouldn't make any sense. Nobody will read it. But because it comes along with the main newspaper, it has that additional value. I mean, it gains value by being associated with the main newspaper. So the editorial page has value, but on an everyday basis, people might not make use of that value. But when they need to look for an opinion, explanation, coherence, understand why a particular policy is good or bad, then they'll consult the edit page. And that day, the edit page must be there and it must have this
Yes.
particular opinion. So you bring it out every day, although it may not be read by everybody on a daily basis.
Since my school days, I have been told by my teachers, in colleges by my professors, and in offices by my bosses that you have to read editorials daily. And it helps also to form opinions and really understand the perspective from different angles. And those were some of my questions, sir. And thank you so much for giving your valuable time for this session. I'm sure the audiences will find your responses intellectually very invigorating. And thank you again for your time.
Thanks. Glad to be part of this. Thank you.